is about to enter.
We've got a break here, too!
The black hole. A journey that begins where everything ends.
When you think of the company Disney, one of the first things you probably think of is their family-friendly brand. Even with their successful market in PG-13 films like the MCU and Star Wars franchise, they still manage to create content that pretty much appeals to all ages. Nowadays, the PG-13 rating barely means anything. Tons of parents are letting their kids watch films like Avengers and Star Wars: The Force Awakens, and considering just how safe Disney makes its films, I'll say that there's nothing wrong with that. But there was a time when even a PG Disney film was considered a risk. For the longest time, all of Disney's films had been rated G. Family-friendly branding was just their thing, and it was working for them. But all of that would change in 1979 with a movie known as Walt Disney's The Black Hole. Many believe Star Wars to be the movie that led to this film's creation, and while that's partially true, The Black Hole actually started out as an idea for a space disaster film in the early 70s with the working title of Space Station 1. The project was shelved for years and brought back later in the 70s. What followed was multiple rewrites of the script and a variety of different directors being attached. Eventually, what started as a disaster film in space morphed into a story about a black hole, a popular topic of discussion at the time. The film was also aiming to be more mature than previous Disney films in an attempt to market towards a more mainstream audience. During the extended period of rewrites, Star Wars had been released in 1977, which likely had a big effect on the script. Gary Nelson was eventually offered the directing gig. He turned it down at first, but later changed his mind after being shown the impressive miniatures and matte paintings done by Peter Ellenshaw. And with concept art as beautiful as this, how could you turn it down? The film was finally released in December of 1979. The overall cost of this very expensive film at the time was $20 million, with the film only making $35.8 million domestically. Yes, the movie did make its money back, but was considered a disappointment in Disney's eyes. Maybe releasing it the same month as the Star Trek movie wasn't such a good idea, but despite the mixed reviews and the low revenue, there's just something about Disney's The Black Hole that really resonates with me. So today I'm here to talk about this odd failure and why I love it. So, what is the black hole exactly? The black hole is the story of the crew of the USS Palomino who are on their way back to Earth when they discover a long-lost ship, the USS Cygnus, docked near a black hole. The Palomino becomes damaged, yet the crew manages to board the Cygnus, where they find the ship commander, Hans Reinhardt, who has been studying the black hole for years. He is aided by a crew of both cloaked and armored robots, and claims that his original crew was sent back to Earth years ago. The Palomino crew trusts Dr. Reinhardt at first, but eventually grows suspicious of his cloaked assistants. A shocking revelation is made when they realize that the cloaked figures are actually the original crew who has been zombified and forced into slavery. Reinhardt turns on the crew as they attempt to escape. An exciting battle ensues as only a few members are successful in making it to an escape pod. The escape pod only gets so far before being sucked into the black hole. At this point, the movie goes completely off the rails as we experience a hallucinatory trip through hell and heaven. The Black Hole is not what I'd call a good movie. The characters are bland, the pacing is slow, action scenes are clunky, and yet it still manages to be one of the most fascinating films ever made by the Disney company, simply for how much hard work and effort was put into it. This movie may be lacking in its script, but visually, this is a beautiful movie. The effects are stunning for the time, relying on a lot of old school effects like miniatures and matte paintings, as well as incorporating some camera tricks that were new at the time. It feels like a vision fully realized, and despite being a clear ripoff in some areas, the majority of the film has its own distinct look. You can tell that the crew working on this put much more effort into the visuals than the writers of the script, even after nearly 10 years of rewrites. I love the design of robots like Maximilian and the Zombified Crew members with the black cloaks and chrome domes. I can't quite say the same for the robots Vincent and Bob. Vincent and Bob are two floating utility robots that clearly only exist to bank off of the success of droids like R2-D2. They serve as entertainment for younger viewers, as a lot of their scenes aren't quite as dull as the constant exposition spewed by the human characters. Vincent is a member of the Palomino crew, while Bob is an abused robot on board the Cygnus, played by the voice of Slim Pickens for some reason.
Who's the flashy black hat?
STAR, Special Troops Arms Regiment. Reinhardt's prototype for the Sentry robots.
He's intentionally supposed to look like someone kicked the shit out of him, but it's such an odd decision, especially considering that there were toys made out of him. Yes, there were toys for Disney's The Black Hole. That's how big they thought this movie was going to be. They wanted this to be their Star Wars. It's also important to note that Bob looks that way because he's bullied by the other robots. Imagine being a robot and then being bullied by other robots. That's like the lowest of the low. It can't get any more embarrassing. The googly eyes are also a really odd touch. I think the thought was that giving them eyes like that would make them more emotive, but it really just makes them harder to take seriously. The Black Hole isn't a film that shies away from darker themes. As mentioned before, multiple characters died throughout this movie, with Anthony Perkins' death being the most graphic. Even the lighthearted comic relief isn't safe in this film, as Bob the Robot gets his own death scene.
You'll never be obsolete. Carry on the tradition. We're the best.
Those lifeless eyes tell you everything you need to know. I think what may be this movie's most fatal flaw is that it lacks originality. The first part of this film feels very much like an episode of Star Trek, with a crew deciding to go off course to check out something mysterious, soon to be greeted by a hospitable host only for him to have an ulterior motive. The second part of this film feels more along the lines of Star Wars, with heavy emphasis on droid-like robots and exciting space battles, if exciting is the right word. The third and final part of this film is very much inspired by 2001: A Space Odyssey's ending, with a trippy descent into the unknown regions of space. I really do love the finale of this movie. It's the strongest aspect of the entire film, and the visuals of hell are actually quite chilling. It's so bizarre that a Disney film would even attempt this back in the 70s, but then again, I'm glad that it did. I also really love the idea of the Zombified Crew, partly because I'm a big horror fan. If Disney ever wanted to remake The Black Hole as a horror movie, they very easily could, but I can guarantee that that'll never happen. The whole concept of this movie actually reminds me of a Disneyland ride, and I think that's another reason that I really love it. I could easily see a coaster ride that follows the same beats of this movie, where you're greeted by a video of Dr. Reinhardt welcoming you on board the ship, followed by a chase through the ship filled with robots shooting lasers at you, and to top it all off at the end, a descent through heaven and hell. Unfortunately, a good Disney ride doesn't always make for a good Disney movie, as Eddie Murphy has taught us. Speaking of Disney rides, there actually was an attempt at a black hole ride during the film's production. The ride was going to be a ride-through shooter where you shoot lasers at robots from the film. And of course, when the black hole wasn't as well received as Disney had hoped, they attempted to bring it back as a Tron ride. But Tron was Tron, so... The ride would eventually see the light of day, but not till 1998 when it was released as Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger Spin. Despite being seen as a failure, The Black Hole would actually be the film to start a new era for Disney. Throughout the 80s, Disney would release a lot more experimental PG films. It would also be the film that led to Disney creating the division of Touchstone Pictures, a way for them to branch out and create more adult-orientated films. In my eyes, the 80s was the most fascinating period of time for live-action Disney. They were taking a lot of great risk that we wouldn't be seeing again, as they'd return to a more traditional route throughout the 90s. Even today, it feels like Disney is a company that's too afraid to take any big risks. They know exactly what makes them money. At this point, it'd be foolish to mess with the status quo. As the great Michael Eisner once said, "We have no obligation to make history, we have no obligation to make art, we have no obligation to make a statement. To make money is our only objective." Somehow that quote is actually from the 80s when it more accurately represents the current state of Disney. Disney's The Black Hole may be no masterpiece, it may not even be a good movie, but there's just so much about this film conceptually that fascinates me. Sometimes the history behind a film and the reason that it exists can be far more interesting than the movie itself. The Black Hole has its fair share of problems, but it was made during a time that Disney was willing to take risks. And that's a big part about why I admire this failed attempt so much. If you haven't checked out The Black Hole, I'd say it's worth at least one watch. Sci-fi fans are sure to get a kick out of some of its ideas and its beautiful visuals. Thank you to everyone who watched this video. I hope to see you again soon with another review. Goodbye.